It was supposed to be just another flight for everyone on board, but for one man, it was anything but ordinary. This man, the CEO of a major airline, was on a mission, one that he had been contemplating for weeks. In recent months, he had been hearing more and more complaints from passengers about the quality of service, issues with comfort, and the overall experience on his airline. These complaints were not just whispers. They were coming through in detailed reports, direct customer feedback, and even social media posts that painted a picture of an airline struggling to maintain the reputation it once had. He had built this airline from the ground up. Years of hard work had gone into making it a brand synonymous with reliability and care. Yet somewhere along the way, it seemed that cracks had started to form. Customers were noticing changes, not for the better, and their voices were becoming impossible to ignore. For a leader like him, this was unacceptable. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. But he didn't want filtered answers from managers or neatly curated reports. He wanted the unvarnished truth, and there was only one way to get it: by experiencing his airline as any ordinary passenger would. That's why, on this particular day, he found himself in economy class, seated in a row towards the back of the plane. There was no fanfare, no special treatment, and no one around him knew who he was. Dressed in a casual outfit that would let him blend in with the crowd, he carried only a small backpack and a notebook to jot down his observations. He had deliberately chosen a flight that wasn't packed with VIPs or executives. This was a regular domestic route where he could immerse himself in the experience of everyday travelers. He wanted to see what they saw, feel what they felt, and encounter the same obstacles they might face. From the moment he arrived at the airport, he had committed himself to anonymity. No personal assistant accompanied him. No one on his staff knew he was doing this. And even the flight crew was unaware of his presence. He checked in like any other passenger, waited in the boarding area, and quietly observed the operations around him. Already he was taking mental notes. The check-in process had been a bit slower than expected, and he noticed several passengers around him struggling with issues like baggage fees and unclear policies. Some seemed frustrated, while others resigned themselves to the situation. By the time boarding began, the CEO had already jotted down a few points in his notebook. He noticed how some passengers struggled to find overhead storage space and how a few of the crew members seemed rushed, offering polite but hurried responses to passengers' questions. It wasn't outright negligence, but it was far from the attentive, customer-first service his airline had once prided itself on. As he made his way to his seat, he felt a mix of emotions. Part of him was proud of how far his airline had come. Every seat on the flight was booked, a testament to its popularity. But another part of him couldn't shake the feeling that the passenger experience wasn't what it used to be. He couldn't ignore the small frowns, the quiet complaints, or the subtle sighs of frustration from those around him. He settled into his seat near the back of the plane, a spot he had specifically chosen to give himself a full view of the cabin and the crew's interactions with passengers. As he adjusted his seatbelt and glanced around, he could hear snippets of conversations from other travelers. Some were talking about their travel plans, while others were exchanging opinions about the airline. At first, he let the chatter fade into the background, focusing instead on the cabin layout, the seat spacing, and the overall atmosphere. But soon, a particular conversation caught his attention. Two passengers seated directly behind him began talking in hushed tones, their voices carrying just enough for him to pick up bits and pieces of what they were saying. What started as casual remarks quickly shifted into something much more serious. As their words began to form a clearer picture, the CEO realized that what he was hearing wasn't just idle gossip. It was a reflection of what many of his customers might be feeling. And in that moment, his undercover journey took on a whole new significance. What he was about to hear would challenge him in ways he hadn't anticipated and force him to confront truths he couldn't ignore. The boarding process began, as it always did, with the initial announcements echoing through the terminal. Passengers were called to board by groups, some listening attentively, while others hovered near the gate, eager to secure their place. The CEO stood quietly to the side, observing everything with a critical eye. As group after group was called, he noticed small inefficiencies that might have gone unnoticed by others. For one, there seemed to be some confusion about boarding zones. Several passengers approached the gate at the wrong time, only to be redirected back to their seats or told to wait. This caused a minor backup, slowing down the process and creating a sense of mild frustration among those waiting in line. The gate agents were polite but seemed slightly overwhelmed, their responses hurried and lacking the warmth he hoped his airline projected. As the CEO made his way down the jet bridge, he watched a family ahead of him struggling to carry their luggage and guide two small children at the same time. No staff member stepped in to offer assistance, and though the family managed on their own, it was a moment that stuck in his mind. Boarding, he thought, should feel smoother, more organized and supportive for all passengers, regardless of their circumstances. Once inside the cabin, he experienced the familiar chaos of passengers searching for their assigned seats and attempting to stow their luggage in the overhead compartments. Several travelers appeared to be having trouble finding space, and as the bins began to fill, a few started shifting other passengers' bags to make room. The CEO noted how this caused some tension, with people glancing around, clearly annoyed but reluctant to say anything. He observed the flight attendants as they moved through the aisles, helping here and there, but with a noticeable sense of urgency. Their smiles, while present, didn't quite reach their eyes, and their interactions felt more like tasks to complete rather than opportunities to create a welcoming environment. The CEO understood the pressures of their job. He had spent years building this business and knew the demands placed on his employees. But he also knew that passengers judged an airline by these very moments. Taking his assigned seat near the back of the plane, the CEO adjusted himself in the somewhat narrow space. The legroom, he noted, was adequate but could certainly be improved for long-haul flights. He glanced around at his fellow passengers, many of whom were still settling in, adjusting their bags, or flipping through the safety card in the seat pocket in front of them. Others appeared visibly frustrated, particularly those who had to place their carry-ons several rows away from their seats due to limited overhead space. He discreetly pulled out his phone and began jotting down notes. There was much to improve, he thought. Boarding efficiency, baggage handling, and staff engagement, to name just a few areas. These weren't monumental issues, but they added up to create an experience that fell short of what he had envisioned for his airline. As he settled into his seat, the CEO prepared to shift his focus to the in-flight experience, eager to see how his staff handled the challenges of a full cabin. But before he could even finish organizing his thoughts, something unexpected caught his attention. It was the conversation coming from the row directly behind him. At first, it was just a few words, quiet enough that he almost ignored it. But as the voices became clearer, he realized that the two passengers seated behind him were discussing something far more important than their travel plans. Their tone wasn't loud or disruptive, but it carried a seriousness that drew him in. He leaned back slightly, careful not to appear obvious, and began to listen. It was a moment of hesitation for him. He hadn't come here to eavesdrop, but curiosity got the better of him. As the conversation unfolded, the CEO found himself growing more and more intrigued. Whatever they were talking about, it seemed to touch directly on the very issues he had been hoping to understand. Little did he know, what he was about to hear would challenge his perception of his airline and his leadership in ways he hadn't anticipated. The CEO was no stranger to hearing complaints about his airline. After all, no company could please everyone all the time. But there was something different about hearing these comments so directly from passengers who had no idea he was there. At first, the conversation behind him seemed ordinary enough, a casual exchange between two passengers passing time before takeoff. The CEO half listened as he reviewed his notes, expecting the usual chatter about travel plans or mundane topics. But then, one of the voices shifted slightly in tone. Passenger 1. I can't believe they charge us for snacks now. Remember when we used to get free meals? I mean, they weren't gourmet or anything, but at least you didn't feel nickel and dimed. Passenger 2 responded almost immediately, their voice tinged with agreement and irritation. Passenger 2. I know, right? And it's not just the snacks. The seats are so cramped now. Feels like they're trying to fit as many people as possible, no matter how uncomfortable it makes the passengers. The CEO felt himself freeze momentarily. He had heard such criticisms before, of course, but hearing it unfiltered, without the veneer of politeness often present in formal feedback, was different. He shifted slightly in his seat, careful not to draw attention to himself, and focused on the conversation. Passenger 1. It's like they've forgotten what it means to actually care about the customer. They're so focused on squeezing every penny out of us that they don't even think about what we're going through. I fly a lot for work, and honestly, I've been looking at other airlines lately. At least they pretend to value their customers. That statement hit harder than the CEO expected. He prided himself on building a brand that emphasized customer satisfaction, yet here was a passenger openly contemplating taking their loyalty elsewhere. He clenched his jaw slightly, realizing that the frustration in their voices wasn't coming from a place of malice. It was genuine disappointment. Passenger 2, you're right. I used to fly with this airline all the time, and it felt like they cared back then. Now it's just, what's the cheapest way to get from point A to point B? And don't even get me started on the staff. Half the time, they look like they don't even want to be here. The CEO's heart sank. He had always believed in treating his employees well, hoping that their satisfaction would trickle down to the passengers. But if even his staff seemed disengaged, it was clear there was a bigger problem than he had anticipated. Passenger 1 sighed deeply, their voice dropping slightly as if to add emphasis. Passenger 1, I get it. Airlines are businesses. They have to make money. But at what cost? It feels like they've completely forgotten about the human side of things. Flying used to feel like an experience. Now it's just a chore. The CEO resisted the urge to turn around and interject. He wanted to explain himself, to tell these passengers that he hadn't forgotten, that he was here to fix these very issues. But he knew that would defeat the purpose of his undercover trip. Instead, he remained silent, listening intently as the passengers continued. Passenger 2, and don't even get me started on those new fees. You want to pick your seat? Extra. You want to bring a carry-on? Extra. At this rate, I'm half expecting them to start charging for oxygen masks in an emergency. The CEO couldn't help but wince at the sarcasm. He had approved some of those policy changes, believing they were necessary to keep the airline competitive. But hearing it framed in such a negative light made him question whether the trade-offs had been worth it. Passenger 1, it's not just this airline though. It's like the whole industry has changed. But still, you'd think they'd want to stand out by being better, not worse. I don't know, maybe I'm just expecting too much these days. The CEO took a deep breath, his mind racing. These passengers weren't angry. They were disheartened. And that, he realized, might be even worse. They had once trusted his airline, even enjoyed flying with it, and now they were left feeling disappointed and undervalued. Passenger 2 chuckled lightly, though there was no humor in it. Passenger 2, well, I guess we can't expect much. They probably don't care what we think anyway. As long as the planes are full and the profits are up, why would they? That statement struck a nerve. The CEO knew that perception was often reality, and if passengers believed the airline didn't care about them, it didn't matter what the truth was. He had to do something to change that narrative, not just for these two passengers, but for everyone who felt the same way. As the conversation continued, the CEO felt a mix of emotions: disappointment, frustration, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He had come on this flight to understand his airline's strengths and weaknesses, and now he was getting exactly what he had asked for: unfiltered, honest feedback. And while it wasn't easy to hear, he knew it was the first step toward making things right. As the CEO continued to listen, the tone of the conversation behind him shifted. It was no longer just a discussion of policies, cramped seats, or indifferent service. One of the passengers began sharing something more personal, a story that cut deeper than the usual gripes about flying. Passenger 1, you know what really upset me? It wasn't even something that happened to me directly. Last month, my mother flew with this airline. She's 78, has trouble walking, and needs assistance to get around. But you'd think anyone working here would notice that, right? There was a pause, and the CEO could hear the frustration in their voice, as if they were reliving the experience in that moment. Passenger 1, the staff didn't even offer her proper assistance. She had to struggle to get to her seat, pulling her carry-on, wobbling down the aisle. I wasn't there to help her, and I don't know, I thought they would step up. Isn't that part of their job? To help people who clearly need it? The other passenger sitting next to them responded quickly, their voice filled with disbelief. Passenger 2, "That's awful. It's not like it's hard to notice someone who needs help. And they say they're customer-focused. What a joke. I can't believe they let that happen." The CEO felt his chest tighten. Of all the complaints he'd heard over the years, this one hit him differently. It wasn't about an overlooked amenity or an impersonal policy. It was about a person. An elderly woman, vulnerable and likely feeling overwhelmed, had been left to fend for herself in a situation where she should have been cared for. Passenger 1 sighed heavily. Passenger 1, "She told me about it when I picked her up from the airport. I could see how upset she was, and it wasn't just because of the physical struggle. She said it made her feel invisible, like she wasn't worth their time or attention. That's what really hurt her. She's the kind of person who never wants to be a bother to anyone, but she needed help. She deserved better." The CEO leaned forward slightly in his seat, gripping the armrest. He had always prided himself on creating a company that valued its passengers, but hearing this story made him question whether those values were truly being upheld. Passenger 2, "It's heartbreaking. I mean, these airlines talk a big game about being inclusive and accessible, but when it comes down to it, actions speak louder than words. Your mom deserved respect, and it sounds like they couldn't even give her that." Passenger 1, "Exactly. And the thing is, she wasn't expecting special treatment. She's not that kind of person. She just needed someone to walk her to her seat or help with her bag. It's not asking for the moon." But no, they were too busy rushing everyone else along, making sure the plane left on time or whatever. The CEO sat back, his thoughts racing. He had heard feedback about operational efficiency many times before, how critical it was to minimize delays and stick to schedules. But hearing this story made him realize that in their quest for efficiency, the human element had been sacrificed. Passengers like this woman, who needed just a little extra care, were being left behind. Passenger 2, "You know what really gets me? It's not just the elderly. I've seen it happen to parents traveling alone with kids, people with disabilities, even first-time flyers who look completely lost. There's no empathy anymore. It's all about keeping things moving, treating people like numbers instead of individuals." The CEO's mind was reeling. He couldn't ignore this. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. And worse, they reflected a culture that seemed to have drifted away from the values he thought were ingrained in the company. Passenger 1, "After that flight, she told me she didn't want to fly anymore. Not with them or anyone else. She said it made her feel too small, too helpless." Can you imagine? Someone who's traveled her whole life now feels like she doesn't belong in an airport anymore. Those words stayed with the CEO, echoing in his mind. He had built this airline on the belief that air travel should be accessible to everyone, that no one should feel excluded or unwelcome. And yet here was a passenger, someone's mother, who had been made to feel exactly that way. Passenger 2, "It's stories like this that make me think twice about flying with them. I mean, if they can't even take care of an elderly woman, what does that say about how much they care about the rest of us?" The CEO felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He knew he couldn't go back and change what had happened, but he also knew this couldn't be ignored. If his airline was failing its most vulnerable passengers, it was failing, period. Passenger 1, "I just wish they'd think about stuff like this more. You know, not just the numbers or the profits, but the people. Because at the end of the day, that's who they're supposed to be serving." The CEO sat silently, absorbing every word. This wasn't just feedback. This was a wake-up call. And he knew that when this flight landed, he would need to start making changes, not just to policies, but to the culture of his entire company. As the plane continued its journey, the CEO couldn't help but reflect on the origins of his airline. Years ago, when he first started the company, he had a vision. It wasn't just about flying people from one place to another. It was about creating an experience, one that passengers could look forward to. Comfort, safety, and excellent service were the pillars of that vision. Back then, he had promised himself that these values would guide every decision, every policy. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. Growth had come quickly, faster than he'd anticipated, Expanding the fleet, introducing new routes, and streamlining operations had become the focus. Investors demanded profits, stakeholders wanted numbers to rise, and efficiency became the mantra. It wasn't wrong to aim for success, but in the pursuit of scaling up, the human aspect of the business seemed to have taken a back seat. He opened his notebook, the same one he'd been jotting his observations in since the boarding process. Staring at the blank page, he began to write. Not just observations this time, but ideas. Ideas for changes that couldn't wait. Improved training for staff to prioritize customer care. He underlined it twice, and training wasn't just about teaching staff how to do their jobs. It was about helping them understand why their jobs mattered. Each passenger wasn't just a ticket sold. They were someone's parent, child, friend, or colleague. The CEO realized that if the staff didn't feel empowered to care for passengers, they wouldn't deliver the kind of service that passengers deserved. He added another point: revisit policies on seating and comfort. The complaints about cramped seats weren't new, but hearing them again today, in person, gave them a new weight. He thought about his own seat in economy class. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't what he'd want to sit in for hours on end. Passengers weren't just asking for luxury, they were asking for dignity, for a little extra space to stretch their legs or lean back without feeling like they were imposing on the person behind them. Next, he wrote, enhance accessibility for elderly and disabled passengers. The story he had overheard about the elderly woman struggling to find her seat replayed in his mind. He couldn't let that happen again. Not on his airline. This wasn't just about better policies. It was about ensuring that every passenger felt seen and valued. Maybe that meant adding more staff during boarding to assist those who needed it, or creating a clear system for identifying passengers who required extra support. He paused for a moment, tapping his pen against the page. These were just a few of the issues he could address right away, but he knew there was more, much more. He needed to dig deeper into the culture of the company to uncover why these lapses were happening in the first place. Was it a lack of accountability? A disconnect between leadership and staff? Whatever the reason, it was his responsibility to fix it. As he wrote, another thought struck him. Listen to passengers more often. Feedback surveys were common, but how often did he or anyone else in leadership truly read them? How often did they take action based on what passengers were saying? Maybe it was time to create a system where passengers could voice their concerns directly and know that those concerns were being heard. His hand hesitated as he added one final note: reaffirm the company's original mission. Somewhere, in all the growth and change, the heart of the airline had been overshadowed by numbers and metrics. It was time to bring it back to what mattered most: the people who chose his airline, trusting it to take them where they needed to go safely, comfortably, and with respect. The CEO leaned back in his seat, his notebook now filled with ideas. It wasn't enough to write them down, though. These ideas had to be turned into action, and action had to lead to meaningful change. He looked out at the passengers around him, most of whom were oblivious to his presence. Each of them had their own reasons for being on this flight: visiting loved ones, heading to a business meeting, or maybe even starting a new chapter in their lives. These were the people who had made his airline successful, and they deserved better. For the first time in a long time, the CEO felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just the head of an airline. He was someone who had the power to make things right. Success isn't just about profits or expansion, he thought to himself, echoing a lesson he'd once believed deeply. It's about the people who trust us to get them where they need to go. And it's about ensuring that trust is never taken for granted. With that, he closed his notebook, resolved to begin a new chapter, not just for himself, but for the airline he had built and the passengers it served. As the flight continued, the CEO debated with himself. Should he say something to the passengers behind him? It wasn't his intention to reveal himself or disrupt the flight, but their conversation weighed heavily on his mind. He had come on this journey to observe and learn, but now faced with first-hand accounts of dissatisfaction and neglect, the stakes felt different. Finally, he made a decision. He turned slightly in his seat and spoke in a calm, approachable tone. "Hi, excuse me," he began, glancing back at the two passengers. "I couldn't help but overhear parts of your conversation. I work for the airline, and I'm really interested in understanding your experiences. Would you mind sharing a bit more? I'd like to take this feedback to our team." The two passengers paused, exchanging a surprised look. For a moment, it seemed they were unsure whether to engage. Then the first passenger, the one who had been recounting the story about his mother, spoke up. "You work for the airline? Are you a manager or something?" "Not exactly," the CEO replied. "I work in a capacity where I can pass along feedback and try to make improvements." Hearing this, the second passenger leaned forward slightly, curiosity overtaking their initial hesitation. "Well, if you really want to know, we've got a lot to say. It's not just about the little things. It's about feeling like we're not valued anymore." The CEO nodded, encouraging them to continue. "Take my mom's situation, for example," the first passenger said, his tone carrying a mix of frustration and disappointment. "She's in her late 70s, struggles to walk long distances, and was traveling alone. We requested wheelchair assistance when we booked her ticket, but when she got to the airport, it wasn't there. She ended up walking all the way to the gate by herself, barely making it in time. It's like nobody cared." The CEO listened closely, his mind already racing with thoughts about how to address such situations in the future. The second passenger chimed in. "And then there's the seating. It's not just that it's cramped. Sometimes it feels like they've squeezed in as many people as possible without thinking about basic comfort. I get it, more seats mean more revenue, but at what cost? People aren't just numbers. We've flown with this airline for years and it didn't used to be like this." The CEO absorbed their words, feeling the weight of their honesty. He knew these issues weren't new. They had likely been raised in feedback forms and surveys before. But hearing them directly from real people with real stories made it all the more impactful. After a pause, the first passenger softened his tone. "Look, we're not saying it's all bad. There's a reason we've kept coming back. The staff used to be so attentive, and the flights were always reliable. That's why it's so frustrating now. It feels like the airline we loved is slipping away." The CEO felt a pang of guilt, but also a glimmer of hope. Despite their frustrations, these passengers still cared enough to share their experiences. They weren't just venting, they wanted the airline to be better. He leaned closer, his voice steady but sincere. "I really appreciate you sharing all of this. I know it takes time and energy to voice these concerns, and it means a lot. I can't make promises on the spot, but I want you to know that your feedback is heard, and it matters." The second passenger gave a small nod. "If you're serious about listening and making changes, that's a good start. People just want to feel like they're being treated with respect." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with the passengers sharing additional observations. Some small, like the quality of in-flight meals, and others more significant, like the inconsistent customer service they had encountered. The CEO took mental notes of everything, determined not to let their words go to waste. This interaction became a turning point for the CEO. Listening directly to his customers without the filter of reports or surveys opened his eyes to the real experiences of those who trusted his airline. It wasn't just about policies or profits anymore. It was about people, their stories, and their expectations. As the conversation drew to a close, the CEO thanked the passengers sincerely. They had no idea they were speaking to the head of the airline, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the renewed sense of purpose their words had sparked in him. He now understood that change wouldn't come from top-down decisions alone. It had to start with listening. The plane had landed and passengers began gathering their belongings. As the CEO sat in his seat, he reflected on the conversation he'd had. It had given him insights he hadn't expected, and now he felt it was time to take the next step. Once the aisle cleared enough for people to move, he turned back to the two passengers who had unknowingly offered him some of the most valuable feedback he'd ever received. With a calm but firm tone, he addressed them once more. "Excuse me again. I wanted to thank you both for taking the time to share your thoughts earlier. What you said really resonated with me, and it's important that I'm upfront with you about something." The two passengers paused, their curiosity piqued. "I'm not just an employee of this airline," the CEO continued. "I'm actually the CEO." There was a moment of stunned silence. The first passenger blinked, seemingly unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Wait, what?" he said. The CEO nodded. "Yes, I run the company, and this flight wasn't just a regular trip for me. I booked it undercover to see what our passengers experience firsthand. I wanted to understand what's working, and more importantly, what isn't." The second passenger looked at him, her expression a mix of shock and intrigue. "You're telling me the CEO of this airline sat in economy class with the rest of us?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," the CEO replied. "And let me tell you, this has been an eye-opening experience. Hearing your feedback directly without any filters or layers has been invaluable. You've helped me see things I couldn't from the boardroom." The first passenger leaned back slightly in his seat, still processing the revelation. "I can't believe it. You didn't have to do this. Most people in your position wouldn't." The CEO smiled faintly. "I believe I did have to. If I want to improve this airline, I need to understand what my passengers are going through, not just through reports or surveys, but by experiencing it myself. And to be honest, I've learned more in this single flight than I have in some of our meetings back at headquarters." The second passenger crossed her arms, a curious expression on her face. "So what now? Are you going to actually fix the things we talked about? Or is this just a PR stunt?" The CEO's expression turned serious. "I can understand why you might be skeptical, but I can assure you this isn't a stunt. I care deeply about this airline and the people who trust us to get them to their destinations safely and comfortably. I've already started making notes on how we can address the issues you raised, things like better customer service training, improved accessibility for elderly passengers, and reevaluating our seating policies. This isn't just about what's profitable, it's about restoring the trust and loyalty of our passengers." The first passenger nodded slowly. "Well, I have to say, I'm impressed. It's not every day you see a CEO who's willing to get their hands dirty like this." The CEO chuckled lightly. "I appreciate that, but the truth is, this is just the beginning. Real change takes time, and it's going to require effort from everyone involved. But I promise you, your feedback will be at the heart of the changes we make." The second passenger's expression softened. "If you mean what you're saying, then maybe there's hope for this airline after all. I'd love to see it get back to what it used to be." "That's the goal," the CEO replied, "and I hope the next time you fly with us, you'll notice the difference." As the conversation wrapped up, the CEO extended his hand to both passengers, thanking them again for their honesty. They shook hands, a sense of mutual respect forming between them. Walking off the plane, the CEO felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing policies or making changes on paper. It was about rebuilding the relationship between the airline and its passengers. For the first time in a long time, he felt connected to the very people his company was meant to serve. Back at headquarters, the CEO wasted no time. The experience of that flight was fresh in his mind, and he was determined to act on what he'd learned. He began by calling an emergency meeting with his management team, bringing together department heads from customer service, operations, and marketing. With the same notebook he'd used during the flight in hand, he started the meeting with a clear message. "We've lost touch with the people who matter most, our passengers. This has to change immediately, and it starts with us." He shared the unfiltered feedback he'd received, detailing the frustration passengers felt about declining service, uncomfortable seating, and a lack of empathy in customer interactions. He didn't mince words, emphasizing the emotional impact of the stories he had heard, particularly the one about the elderly passenger who struggled without proper assistance. "This isn't just about policies or budgets," he said firmly. "It's about rebuilding trust and showing people that we care. If we don't prioritize their experience, nothing else matters." Over the following weeks, the CEO worked tirelessly with his team to implement sweeping changes. The airline launched new customer-focused initiatives designed to address the very issues passengers had raised. First on the list was an overhaul of staff training. Every employee, from gate agents to flight attendants, underwent a program emphasizing empathy, communication, and proactive problem-solving. Next came seating policies. The airline introduced more options for passengers, focusing on comfort and space, even in economy class. The changes aim to strike a balance between profitability and customer satisfaction, ensuring that no passenger felt crammed or overlooked. Finally, accessibility improvements were rolled out. The airline established a dedicated team to assist passengers with special needs, ensuring they received the care and support they deserved from the moment they arrived at the airport to the time they left their destination. These changes weren't just announced with fanfare, they were implemented with measurable outcomes in mind. As these initiatives rolled out, the airline communicated them transparently, sharing updates with passengers through emails, social media, and in-flight announcements. They made it clear that these changes weren't just for appearances, they were a genuine effort to listen and respond. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the people you serve. For this CEO, one flight wasn't just a journey from point A to point B, it was a wake-up call. That conversation at 30,000 feet became the catalyst for transformation, not just for the airline, but for its passengers, who now saw a company that truly cared. It was proof that even in the world of business, listening can lead to meaningful change. The CEO's journey didn't end with that single flight. It marked the beginning of a new era for the airline, one where passengers felt valued, respected, and heard. And for the CEO, it was a reminder that the success of any business starts with putting people first. This story serves as a powerful reminder of what true leadership looks like. It's not just about making big decisions from the corner office or strategizing for growth on a whiteboard. Leadership is about stepping into the shoes of the people you serve, understanding their challenges, and being willing to make changes, no matter how difficult or inconvenient they may seem. For this CEO, the experience was humbling. It wasn't just about fixing problems. It was about acknowledging where things had gone wrong and taking responsibility. His willingness to listen, to act, and to place the needs of his passengers at the heart of his decisions speaks to the kind of leadership we should all strive to see more of, not just in business, but in every aspect of life. This is a story of accountability, of learning from mistakes and transforming those lessons into meaningful action. It's a reminder that no matter how large or small a company is, its success is built on the trust and loyalty of the people it serves. That trust isn't just given, it's earned every day, with every interaction and with every decision. Now, here's a question for you. What if more companies operated with this level of transparency and accountability? What if every leader took the time to listen to the people who rely on their products or services? Imagine the kind of change that could bring, not just to businesses, but to entire industries. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think the CEO made the right move? What would you have done in his place? And how would you feel if the companies you interact with every day showed this kind of commitment to their customers? Let us know in the comments below. Join the conversation and share your perspective on this story. And if you believe in the power of empathy, action, and leadership that puts people first, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you real stories that inspire real change, and we'd love for you to be part of this journey with us. Thank you for watching, and remember, whether you're a leader, a customer, or just someone trying to make a difference, change begins with listening and the courage to take the first step.